Tomorrow, one of Britain's best-known businessmen goes on trial in Chicago for racketeering and criminal fraud. In this grim, monolithic building, the full weight of US justice is about to bear down on Conrad Black. A flamboyant and controversial media mogul, Conrad Black's empire stretched from the Daily Telegraph halfway round the world. A man with an appetite for the billionaire lifestyle.
He certainly liked the money, and the more of it he got, the more of it he wanted. It was a little bit like a cocaine addiction, I guess.
With his wife, Barbara Emile, Lord Black was the talk of the town.
I mean, they were made for each other. She had her tongue hanging out for wealth, just like Conrad had his tongue hanging out for sex.
If Conrad Black is found guilty, he could face the rest of his life behind these bars. I've been following Conrad Black's career for more than 20 years. I even worked for the man. In that time, he scaled the heights. But now, he's close to rock bottom, fighting to stay out of jail. Tonight, on the Money programme, how did Conrad Black climb so high and fall so low? Citizen Kane, one of cinema's most famous press barons. Rich, ruthless, surrounded by beautiful women, and fatally flawed. There are extraordinary echoes of Kane in Conrad Black's life and career. To those who know him well, he's a man of magnetism and presence, worthy of Hollywood.
You find that when he enters a room, he carries his own climate.
Is it warm or cold?
Generally warm. The thing you always saw at these events were those who were trying to cheerfully force themselves up his fundament, gathering around him like bees around a honeypot.
Like Kane, Black made a fortune and revelled in the company of the powerful and glamorous.
I loved Conrad's parties. They were great fun. Liz Hurley in one corner, Prince Michael in the other, Prince Andrew in the other, two cabinet ministers in the other, Mrs. Thatcher over one side, a lot of young and beautiful women. Conrad used to stand on the stairs, basically preening, basically going, I've arrived. Look at them, they've all come to my party.
And like Kane, Black's a man who has attracted ferocious critics.
He's an egoist. He is a self-promoter. He is a terrific performer. He is a man with consummate belief in himself. He believes himself to be supreme and to be entitled to fame, to fortune, and to divine deliverance.
Even so, Black's been badly shaken by the way former associates have turned on him in troubled times.
I had thought a good many friends in the British media who would at least give me a fair hearing. They didn't do it. I thought it was disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. That's what I think of it.
Who is Conrad Black? A pillar of the establishment or a big-time fraudster? The greatest newspaper tycoon of his generation or a cheap con man? Only one thing is certain. He seemed to have everything and was prepared to risk it all. Conrad Black descended on London in 1985. He was virtually unknown, even though he came from a wealthy Canadian family and had built a newspaper empire in his home country. It was this that Black coveted, the Daily Telegraph. I now work for the paper. It's one of the world's great titles. But back then, it had fallen on hard times and needed someone to save it. The paper's journalists, and I was one of them, gave the mysterious suitor a cautious welcome.
When it became clear that the ownership of the Telegraph was maybe not as rock solid as we all thought it was, there was an immediate speculation that, well, one of the other owners might be Robert Maxwell, or it could be Tidy Rowland of Lonero. Now, set against that background and in that context, Conrad Black seemed very much Mr. Clean.
Black somehow persuaded the Telegraph's former owners to sell up at a bargain price. He convinced all around him that, unlike some media moguls, he was a man to trust.
Some are likable, some are trustworthy, and some are not. I won't comment on our likability, but I believe we are trustworthy, and I believe we will be perceived as trustworthy.
And for a few years at least, that seemed to be the case. Conrad Black regarded the Telegraph as his most valuable business. It marked his arrival on the world stage, and for a while he bathed in its glory. But then things changed. In the early 90s, Black set about raising millions of pounds by selling shares in the Telegraph to city investors and staff. He insisted the company was safe in his hands. But within a month, he slashed the price of the Telegraph to fight a price war with Rupert Murdoch's Times, something he'd promised not to do.
He had sold the shares of the company, taking it public, knowing that there was going to be this huge price cut, which was bound to affect the cash flows of the company. Newspapers are cash machines. He just cut off part of the cash machine in a price war with Murdoch.
As a result, the Telegraph's share price collapsed. Staff members, such as Bill Jameson, who'd bought shares, were now badly out of pocket. They felt betrayed.
There was a lot of anger in the office about it. It was quite a shock for people perhaps who'd never held shares before. So it didn't go down well with the staff at all.
Black's move also infuriated professional investors who'd bought shares and lost money. His reputation in the financial world was savaged.
The City of London felt shafted by Conrad Black. And you know, it was a harbinger of things to come, because it was really an indication of how all along Conrad treated the whole company as a private company, that public ownership was just something that got in the way. Shareholders were people to come up with the money, but once they handed over the money, it was his money.
Black, trustworthy? Not anymore. But he'd extracted millions of pounds from investors and was ready to feast on the fruits of success. With the ownership of the Telegraph, Conrad Black leapt up the social ladder. Everyone craved his attention, including an ambitious and vivacious journalist called Barbara Emile.
She wanted wealth with knobs on, and she had her tongue hanging out for wealth, just like Conrad had his tongue hanging out for sex. And the two of them were naturally attracted. I mean, they were made for each other. He offered the wealth, she offered the glamour and the sex. It was perfect.
After they married, Barbara became a star columnist for the Telegraph. She and Conrad took London's party circuit by storm.
You're beautiful.
Oh, I can't.
Yes, you are. You're very, very beautiful.
I've never been to see.
As with Kane and his wife, the Black social world was grand and mightily expensive.
Paintings, pictures, statues, enough for 10 museums. The loot of the world.
Conrad travelled around London in a magnificent Rolls-Royce, refurbished at a cost of £90,000. Barbara, meanwhile, would make do with only the most exclusive brands. Chanel, where handmade dresses cost upwards of £25,000, was a particular favourite. And when it came to shoes, it just had to be Manolo Blahnik at around 400 quid a pair. Barbara's cupboards were full of them. In one of London's most exclusive areas, they bought an 11-bedroom mansion with a vast area for entertaining. And when guests arrived, they were met by a brigade of servants catering for their every need. At the pinnacle, Black turned his back on Canada to become a British lord.
Conrad, Moffat, Black.
Friends understand why the pomp meant so much to him.
I, Conrad Lord Black of Cross Harbour, do swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful.
I mean, he's hardly alone in wanting to gain honours, is he? Might seem alien to you and me, but I think to these power players on the world stage, these sort of affirmations of their gravitas are important.
Black now had almost everything he wanted. He lived like a billionaire. The trouble was, he was only a millionaire. That difference was the key to his downfall. Black's newspaper business, called Hollinger, was headquartered here in Manhattan. Some of its American shareholders were mystified. They couldn't understand why the company's profits were so poor and dividends so low. Black's companies, it seemed, weren't doing that well. But Conrad and Barbara were flourishing. Their lifestyle was fabulous and they were spending fortunes. Investors here in New York City began to wonder, how was he footing all those personal bills? In 2003, one of those puzzled investors decided to look closely at Hollinger's books.
What it really comes down to is reading the public documents, going back and saying, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense. And after you do that about 32 times, you say, there's something wrong here.
Denton found that Hollinger was making money, but much of it, 95% of the entire net profit, appeared to be going to Black and a small group of senior managers, leaving little for other shareholders. Black was acting as if he owned the company.
I was dumbstruck, actually. He described himself as the proprietor, meaning the owner. He wasn't the owner. He was a part owner. It was our company, meaning Lord Black and ourselves, not his company. He didn't make that distinction, or didn't want to make that distinction.
Although he didn't own the company, Black did have complete control. He had only 1/3 of the company's shares, but remarkably, they gave him 2/3 of the voting rights, so he could act like the proprietor. Other shareholders decided he was running the company for his benefit, and they'd had enough. With their patience running out, Black's co-shareholders wanted to know what he'd done with their money. They called in one of America's most aggressive corporate lawyers, a real Rottweiler, Eisen Hoffa.
This is one of those cases where there's so much wrongdoing in so many different areas that the most difficult thing about the case is just keeping track of it all.
You are very experienced. Were you surprised by what you found?
You know, despite the fact that you can become awfully jaded when you see one case after another of corporate wrongdoing, yeah, I have to tell you, I think that I really was surprised.
Eisen Hoffa's hunt for the missing millions led first to some of New York's finest restaurants, where Conrad Black was fond of hosting lavish events. One of these dinner parties was for Conrad Black's wife, Barbara Emile. It was her 60th birthday, and he wanted it to be an unforgettable occasion, the bash of a lifetime. 80 A-list celebrities were invited. Stars from business, politics and fashion, gorged on fine wines, caviar and lobster. They had it large. The bill for dinner came to a mouth-watering $63,000. But lawyers discovered that Black had charged 2/3 of that cost back to the company. What better way to really enjoy yourself than with somebody else's money? Lawyers claimed that the Blacks had been using the company's jets as private taxis, costing shareholders $1 million in 1 year alone. Among Conrad and Barbara's destinations was Bora Bora in the South Pacific. The price paid by the company for that holiday was allegedly $250,000. On the way back, the Blacks stopped off and took in a Wagner opera. Lawyers say tickets were often charged to the company. Some of Barbara's shopping trips were also funded by the firm. Handbags, clothes, even tips to doormen. But Black rejects any notion that he and the missus lived the high life at others' expense.
I don't live extravagantly. I am a moderately well-to-do person. By the standards of contemporary fortunes, I'm not a rich man, but I never lived beyond my means at all. And the alleged evidence of it, as if we had some endless social life at our own, or indeed the employees' and shareholders' expense, is a complete fabrication.
The lawyers were having none of that. They claimed that they'd found extensive misuse of company perks. The dogs were barking.
I think that it absolutely is one of the worst, if not the worst case I've seen, and I think that the wrongdoing was extensive, it was pervasive. You were on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the worst example. I think you'd find that Conrad Black is probably somewhere around 50.
All this lavish expenditure turned out to be, well, just small change compared with what the lawyers discovered next. With more of their time spent in New York, the newspaper mogul and his wife needed an appropriate residence. But no ordinary flat would do. They went looking in Park Avenue. As a local estate agent told me, it's the most prestigious, well-heeled street in the city.
This area was very peopled by the sort of the gentry of America.
Old money.
Old money, blue blood, the barons of finance and media and industry in America.
Really? So
and frankly, there's much of that tone still left here.
So if you're Conrad Black living here, it
Yes.
would really say something about you. It would be a statement to the world as to the kind of person you've become.
Absolutely.
Black chose a magnificent apartment in one of Park Avenue's finest buildings. As Hollinger's chairman and chief executive, Conrad Black instructed the company to buy the flat for him and Barbara. The price, $3 million. So this is the kind of apartment that Conrad Black would have had.
Absolutely. The scale in these pre-war homes and the substantial feel in these homes are the signatures of its quality. You see the molding.
This flat seemed nice enough to me, but Conrad Black's place was, apparently, extra special. And they have a rarity value because there aren't that many buildings like this, are there?
They're not making pre-war anymore, that's for sure.
Yep.
And the spaces are very open and grand. This living room here, certainly no exception to that rule. This apartment is huge. Mr. Black's apartment could house this apartment 3 times.
Wow. Some years later, Black wanted to own the flat personally, so he decided to buy it from the company he ran. Even though New York property prices had been soaring, Black wrote a cheque for the same amount that Hollinger had paid for it 6 years earlier, $3 million. If I said to you, you can buy an apartment like this in 6 years' time at today's prices, would you do it?
Oh, heck yeah. Absolutely. Who wouldn't? Absolutely.
It will be a fine deal.
Boy, oh boy.
The lawyers concluded that Black had acquired for himself a company asset at millions of dollars below true value. They suspected that this was a stunt he'd pulled before on an even bigger scale. In the sleepy town of Olean, in upper New York State, the local paper is delivered every afternoon. At one time, the paper was owned by Hollinger, the public company run by Black. Back then, one of the senior staff at the Olean Times-Herald was Chuck Ward. He was proud of the paper and loved his job.
You can't wait to get to work. You can't wait to be thinking about the next day. And I never could imagine any other job that brought me more satisfaction than being part of a great newspaper, and it was a great newspaper.
But to Chuck's amazement, Hollinger suddenly sold the highly profitable paper to new owners. He couldn't understand why. Then the small-town mystery deepened. The people who'd bought the paper privately turned out to include none other than Conrad Black, who also ran Hollinger. Chuck was baffled, then suspicious.
My immediate reaction was, this doesn't feel good, it doesn't smell good, there's no good touch to it, so maybe it stinks.
Shareholders' lawyers followed the pong. Black and his second-in-command at Hollinger had snapped up dozens of local papers from the public company they controlled. And yes, they'd paid tens of millions of dollars below market prices. The stench was rising.
I think his behavior was an absolute disgrace.
So Conrad Black is buying company assets on the cheap, selling them to himself. How does that damage the other shareholders?
Well, it damages the other shareholders. If you have an asset that's worth $10 million and you buy it for $100,000, then the shareholders have been cheated out of $9.9 million. And Conrad Black and the cronies who are working for him underpaid for these newspaper assets consistently.
So how did they get away with it? Deals like this were approved by Hollinger's independent directors. But most of these people were high-powered friends of Conrad, appointed by him. They included his wife, Barbara, Richard Pearl, who'd been a senior White House advisor, and even Henry Kissinger.
Lord Black was just way too chubby with his board of directors. They looked on him as their pal, their friend, and they just really weren't engaging in what their function is, which is to be the oversight to make sure that management is doing its job.
Lawyers had now discovered a number of schemes by which they believed Conrad Black was enriching himself at shareholders' expense, and they were about to uncover the biggest one of all. Here in New York City, the deeper that Black's opponents dug, the worse it got for him. But then the trail crossed the border to Canada, to his homeland, and there the allegations became even more extraordinary. The fictional Kane was a powerful press baron, his newspapers affording him wealth and influence, just like Conrad Black. But in the year 2000, Black caused shock by starting to dismantle Hollinger's newspaper empire, selling hundreds of local papers to a Canadian media company called CanWest. Up here in Canada, CanWest bosses told me that they wanted to make sure that Hollinger wouldn't come back into the market with new papers to compete against the titles they had just bought. So they insisted on a non-competition agreement.
It's quite natural, from my perspective, to not want to compete with them. And who better would know the weaknesses of our newspapers than these people who happen to be, not only do they know the assets, but they're the shrewdest operators of newspapers that I think exist in the world today.
But according to lawyers, Black had been shrewd in another way too. He claimed that a chunk of the price that CanWest had paid for Hollinger's papers was a fee for this non-competition agreement. OK, say the lawyers, but if that were true, the cash should have gone to all Hollinger shareholders. Instead, Black and 3 other company executives pocketed the lot.
They managed to divert about $80 million in Canadian dollars to themselves out of the purchase price. This was a repeated pattern which took place over a 4 or 5 year period where Black and the individual executives at Hollinger decided, hey, this is a nice little pool of money. Why don't we divert some of this to us?
Lawyers claim that Black and his cronies, through various schemes, had sucked $400 million out of Hollinger in 7 years. It just couldn't go on.
How are you feeling? Big room here?
In 2003, Hollinger's shareholders forced Black to quit as the company's boss.
Mr. Black, anything to say to your shareholders?
But all you fellows who wrote today that I'm finished may not have it right, huh?
Do you insist you have done absolutely nothing wrong, sir?
There's no suggestion of an impropriety. Read the press release.
But shareholders had read quite enough, thank you, about their missing money. Armed with boxes of evidence, they launched huge civil lawsuits, claiming hundreds of millions of dollars, which they said Black had taken.
I don't know what you want to call it, but looting is probably right up there.
I mean, Lord Black would say it's not illegal to be greedy.
It is not illegal to be greedy, but it is not appropriate to take money out of a corporation on an unauthorized basis.
Now writs were being dished out all over the place, including to Black's family and friends on the board, who had apparently failed to prevent him looting the company.
I don't really think that any of them had any idea what was going on, but they should have. It's nice to go to the board meetings. It's nice to cash the check. It's nice to get the royal treatment, but it comes with some responsibilities, and when you don't exercise those responsibilities, shareholders are now going to hold you accountable.
Chicago, where Conrad Black used to do a lot of business. Now it's the venue for his toughest test. While shareholders are chasing him for money, criminal prosecutors in this building are threatening his liberty with charges of fraud and racketeering.
Chicago's formidable legal system has form. In the past, it has meted out harsh punishments to the likes of Frank the Enforcer Nitti, Johnny the Brains Torrio, and Al Scarface Capone. Now it confronts Conrad the Proprietor Black, who is alleged to have lifted out sums of which those old mobsters could only dream.
Good afternoon. For years, Conrad Black lived large on millions of shareholder dollars. And today a grand jury returned an indictment alleging that he did so by means of repeated criminal frauds.
Tomorrow, Conrad Black's trial begins. It's a steep fall since those high-living days. The company jets have long gone. Lawyers' bills have forced him to sell his London house. Proceeds from the sale of his New York home have been seized by the court. And if he were found guilty, his new residence would be down this very corridor, in a jail cell. Other recent US corporate corruption cases have resulted in life sentences for the guilty. But Black denies all charges of harming other shareholders and remains utterly defiant.
The fact is, we created over $1 billion of value for the shareholders. They've done nothing but make money. There are no victims. They have no complaints. This whole story is a fraud. That is the scandal. The scandal is not my behavior. The scandal is the behavior of my accusers.
At the end of Cain's story, the old boy withdrew to his castle to reflect on his downfall. Who was to blame, himself or others? As for Black, his critics have no doubt.
He really reached a very high point in the business world, and unfortunately, his weakness and greed, caused him to throw it all away. And I think that it's really tragic.
And what went wrong? Was there a flaw in Conrad?
The feeling that the rules that apply to normal folk didn't apply to him. That you could short-circuit normal business practice in a public company.
What do I think of Conrad Black? I think he's an arrogant man whose biggest mistake was to surround himself with yes-men. He had no one to rein him back, no one to say no. Whether he wins or loses in that Chicago courtroom, he's already learned the hard way that the price of excess is a high one.
For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/moneyprogram. Next time, we follow supermodel Elle Macpherson's journey from cover girl to boardroom big shot as she launches her new lingerie range. That's Friday, the 23rd of March at 7 on BBC Two.